All right, does that work? There we go. Okay. So yeah, I've spent over 11 years working for state regulatory, working for the regulator, and as well as overseeing what's going on around the rest of the United States. As a brief reminder, the United States is a federalist system. We have the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which has jurisdiction over the transmission, largely the generation, and all the way down to roughly 100 kV, kV lines. Everything below that, which is generally considered intra-state commerce, is regulated at the state level. So my background is largely working at the state level, although I also have worked, I started my career as a paralegal working on FERC matters. So I apologize, my formatting is a mess. My degree is actually in history, so I'm not the best at making up charts and graphs and formatting PowerPoints. So a lot of my discussion is going to be focused on the increasing growth and use of technology, as well as the importance of the distribution system with the growth of distributed energy resources. So in the United States, a lot of the discussion around grid modernization basically is focusing around a couple of topics. In the US, we have a substantial aging infrastructure where we have poles and wires that have been sitting up, poles and wires that are aging, that are upwards of 50 to 60 years. States without AMI, the analog meters have been there for 30 to 40, if not longer. So we have a substantial amount of aging infrastructure that needs to be replaced. In addition, we have the increased proliferation of distributed energy resources. And the way I define DER is not just rooftop solar and distributed wind and energy storage, and electric vehicles and microgrids, but also includes energy efficiency and demand response. All of those, when I say DER, I mean all of those different technologies are part of DER. So when we have a joining of aging infrastructure as well as an increased role of distributed energy resources, that puts a different set of strains upon both the regulated utility as well as the regulator, because now it's an opportunity to start planning more wisely for what does the distribution system need to look like, what type of technologies need to get put onto the system in order to refresh the system to handle increased growth and use of distributed energy resources. In the meantime, as well as all that, of course, we have to plan for future system needs as well as maintain reliability and resilience. Part of that comes with a large amount of new utility investments in the system. So what these two charts are here to represent is the type of information that previously was unavailable to the utility. What this chart is from San Diego Gas and Electric. This is actually several years old now, but it shows how the impact of rooftop solar can be masked if you don't have sufficient information about the distribution system. So this deals with rooftop solar intermittency, and this is basically power, so quality, right? So if the utility only has 1 hour visibility into its system over a day, this is what the power quality, this is what the voltage, the power level looks like at a location. As we start to get 5-minute information, we've gone from a relatively flat line to a little bit more up and down as it starts to see what the power flow is looking like off of the rooftop solar. Now we have 1 minute. Now you get to see how much fluctuation is actually going on at a 1 minute level. And then lastly down here we have 10 second. The importance is if your utility, that's the only level of visibility you have, you're going to plan your system very differently than if you had 10-second visibility into your system. This means that you're going out of band quite often within a 1 hour period for voltage requirements. The chart over there on the other side is a more recent one from Hawaii Electric Utilities. And again, this shows voltage qualities. Sorry, I'm going to bounce over here for a second. So this is the voltage band that utilities are allowed to operate under. This is what they're shooting for as far as voltage up toward the higher end. And this is where actual voltage is showing up in response to rooftop solar. Again, you see at various points it's outside of the voltage band that they're supposed to be operating their system in. Without the availability or the visibility in the system, the utility again would have no idea this is going on. which means they would plan for the system very differently, and the impacts of that solar onto the system and onto other customers would also be very different. So the utility is now able to see what type of information is going on, plan, and utilize other resources to manage this. By the way, these voltage fluctuations can also be handled by the solar installation itself through the availability of advanced inverters. So with that as the leading into it, what have been the actions that we see at the regulatory level as well as at the utility level in response to the growth of distributed energy resources? So we see things like more use of technology. When we have a very analog system that sees things once a day, once an hour, or an ANI meter that only collects information once a month, we have very poor quality visibility. More technology allows the utility to gather more information and provide and get more visibility in the system. We see regulators across the United States looking to take more use of distribution system planning. Utilities traditionally do a distribution system plan because they have to do that, but it's often locked well inside the utility with no visibility and no transparency to either the regulator or the market. So we see regulators across the U.S. looking to break open the utility distribution system planning process to actually allow the utility and other market participants to help the utility better plan for the system going forward. We see the utilities and regulators and markets really pushing to have hosting capacity. That hosting capacity basically means at any point on the distribution system, there is a certain amount of available capacity that the system can handle from a new entrant, like solar. Part of this discussion then moves into how do you identify the locational net value and the benefits that these distributed energy resources can provide to the system. We have questions around how to update the interconnection processes across the United States. The state that I currently live in, Minnesota, we were one of the very first states to develop an interconnection process in 2003. We haven't updated it since 2003. And so we're currently in the process of updating our interconnection process, again, because in 2003 in Minnesota, there was not a lot of new rooftop solar, or any solar for that matter, showing up on the system. But now, because of additional policy changes, the Minnesota utilities are seeing lots of interconnection requests. So we have a process that it's outdated and that needs to be updated to reflect the changing conditions as well as the market realities of the state. And lastly, we have, of course, the bread and butter of the regulators, the rates. And when we talk about technologies, what type of technologies are we seeing being used and implemented by the utilities to address the growth of distributed energy resources as well as to assist in the planning and the hosting capacity? Well, first and foremost, we have AMI. In my opinion, AMI is a foundational component of any utility infrastructure investment that is going to focus on grid modernization. Quite frankly, AMI is the endpoint data. So utilities in the United States may have visibility to the transformer level, which still will mask what the individual customer is doing. So this data point is something that's really, really important for the utility planning functions. You heard Jonathan Pettit earlier this week talk about how they're using AMI data to start doing their SAIDI measurements. They are still the only ones I'm aware of in the United States that are using it, which is a very important point to understand how well the system is reliably performing. When you have AMI, you have to also have a meter data management system. So the AMI information that gets sent to the utility without an MDMS, it's really difficult for the utility to put the data together and spit out something that's useful to anybody, including the utility. Then as we start progressing down in the distribution system, the next step we see is advanced distribution management systems. This is a suite of software and some hardware that allows the utility to have the distribution system be managed in a more automated way so that it can autonomously respond to things that are going on across the system. Then when you start seeing lots of distributed energy resources show up on the system, you start seeing utilities talk about distributed energy resource management systems. So this is being discussed currently in California and Hawaii and a little bit in New York, where instead of focusing on the distribution system, now this allows for control of the distributed energy resources themselves where appropriate. We have smart inverters. So all rooftop solar, as well as just all generation resources, have an inverter to change the DC power into AC for delivery in the United States system. The growth of rooftop solar, those inverters on top of the houses change the current from DC to AC, but can now also mitigate voltage issues that are generated from the AV system or PV system, and can divert the power into the home, into a battery storage system located at the home. The way the US, so this is really important in the US because the way that interconnection standards have worked in the US is that if there's an outage, if there's a regional outage and there's any solar, the solar also has to shut down. So if I'm a house and my neighbors have a blackout, I also have a blackout and can't use my solar that's on top of my roof, even though it may be generated because of safety issues. With a smart inverter that can redirect the electricity directly into my house with no power going onto the system to risk the linemen who want to restore power. And then we have all this, of course, has to be built upon standards interoperability. And lastly, the other fun thing that utilities like to talk about is fault location, isolation, and service restoration, lovingly known as FLISR, which again supports a lot of the ADMS systems around automatic responses to restoration of an outage. These, of course, are not cheap. So how the utility and the regulator then reviews these investments becomes really important. Some parts of these technologies are more important down at the bottom than they are than others are. So when we talk about understanding the system, if the utility has no visibility in the system, it can't do a very good job of planning. So it needs to understand its system, whether it's has AMI or not, whether it has full SCADA across all of its distribution lines or not. Understanding the capability of the system becomes really important, especially when we're talking about better utilization and optimization of distributed energy resources. So what this chart is from is just is a technology adoption curve that is overlaid with time as well as technology. So what's above here, above the line, is adoption levels of distributed energy resources, and what's below the line or on this side of the line is utility investments in response to the DER levels. So when you are a utility and you have very low adoption of DER, such as rooftop solar, you have the time to actually start planning, figuring out what is your replacement schedule going to be for your aging infrastructure, what investments do you see as foundational to support when you have greater and greater amounts of distributed energy resources penetration. So like I said, in the US, this is focusing a lot on aging infrastructure replacement, as well as what foundational advanced grid installations does the utility need to make. The planning component of this is vital for the regulator to be part of. Because what we see in the US is utilities coming in and looking at this opportunity as the ability to throw a bunch of capital investments into the rate base without very little organization or thought. So having a planning function overseen and engaged with the regulator helps to ensure that the utility investments actually have a reason, they have a purpose. They're not just there to put more money in a rate base so the utilities can increase rate base. Because there are lots of things that utilities may want to do that are great for high level that have no real reason to be put in there if they have very low adoptions. So understanding the adoption rates as well as the appropriate technology choices is a very key component that the regulators are looking at now in the United States. Is how do we transition from down there with technology to get to here, with technology to get to there with technology. As a reminder, this is an evolution. These are not going to be solved today, tomorrow. Rahul, we talked about this is going to be another 5 years. This is probably 10, 15-year evolution over time, if not longer, to get from where we are today to what some people are calling for a more transactive market platform. So when we're talking about distribution system planning, what does that actually mean? So this is a picture of how to put the pieces together. Currently, we know that utilities do, in the US at least, we do resource planning, we do transmission planning. We also know the utilities have a distribution assessment because if nothing else, they have to know where new load is going to show up. If there's a new subdivision being built, they have to plan for where that new load is. And we know that there's an annual long-term distribution planning process because if nothing else, utilities have to replace infrastructure. But what we're asking the utilities to do now is to take, on the distribution side, take what they already do today, the current assessment in the long term, but then start using information that they are collecting through both the hosting capacity analysis as well as from the interconnection studies, put them all together to do a more robust distribution plan. The addition of the host capacity interconnection studies is important because these are data points that tell the utility where things are happening or where they need to invest in. So if they have an area, if they do the host capacity analysis and they have an area where they know there's very little available capacity, then they know that that area may be ripe for new investment. When they start utilizing the interconnection information, they know where people are seeking to interconnect. So they put interconnection with host capacity, figure out what is the available capacity of those two areas, and then they can put it in the distribution plan to know where new investment is needed as opposed to relying on outdated replacement schedules. So you put the distribution planning functions together, and then you start to integrate it with multiple scenarios as well as the resource and transmission planning. Traditionally, the transmission and resource planning doesn't really care about what's going on distribution. It has a number for what the demand looks like, and then they plan above it. What we're asking utilities to start doing now, or regulators are asking utilities to do now, is take the information from the distribution system and have that be on equal footing with resource and transmission. Because if a load need can be solved by the distribution system, then that avoids the need to build either a new transmission line or build a new power plant. All this, of course, has to flow into multiple scenarios around adoption rates, load growth or no load growth, so that it all becomes informed upon each other. Then when you get those two done, then you move into the identification of benefits and sourcing and the utilization of DER generally in solving all of this together.
Chris, if I could just request you to
move along?
Yes, please.
Okay.
We're running a little late, and yeah.
Okay.
To bring it to the key points, yeah.
All right, we'll move along to this. So I'll take briefly. Locational net benefits. This is a wheel graph from the Rocky Mountain Institute for storage. Suffice to say what this means is identification of the type of benefits that any particular DER resource can provide is an opportunity to then to compensate and then figure out the appropriate rate for the resource. What's going on in the U.S. now is talking about what is the future of the distribution utility going to look like. So we talk about things in the U.S. around a distribution system operator, which acts a lot like in our regional transmission organization, but for the distribution system. Basically, the distribution system now operates the distribution system like a transmission system operator does. Then when you get that built out, then you start looking at the utility or the distribution operator as a platform provider. So what other things, like a platform, like we traditionally think of Amazon as a platform, what other things does that platform provider can solve?
I guess for India, that's equal to carriage and content separation, the
Yes.
separation of wires and retail. So this is
it's a
coming
little bit beyond that, yeah.
in India.
Yeah. And so what ends up happening in rethinking the way the distribution system and the utility is going to be operated is we have this revisioning of how the distribution system becomes organized, where you try to break down the silos. So for example, you have this one, which is a communication network. So instead of having an AMI network and a SCADA network and an ADMS network and an OMS network, you have one network that all those things can access. So you figure out what are the enterprise-wide things, what are the enterprise-wide platforms that other things can be built on. And then over time you figure out where's the utility, what's a market, and what can be built on top of it. Okay, so what this all rolls up into as it applies to the regulator is the impact it has on rate making. So as I said, utilities make money on capital. They get a higher rate of return on CapEx than they do on OpEx. What we're asking utility to do now is to rely on less utility investments for reliability and for delivery of electricity through the use of greater utilization of customer DER. Which means that if we want a more efficient system, but the incentives are to build, we have a disconnect in the rate-making structure. Especially since customers themselves are increasingly using their own money to invest in their own technology, such as thermostats. I don't need a rebate necessarily to go buy a new thermostat. I can do it on myself, on my own. So we have states that are trying to figure out ways to make up the difference. So like New York State has a number of initiatives going on around, well, maybe a cloud solution, which is typically viewed as an operational expense. You'll get a higher ROE on a cloud investment than to make up the difference between the OpEx and the CapEx. Additionally, when we talk about rates, most states use an average cost of rate making.
So Chris, if I could just request, our chairman would be leaving soon, so he's requested you to.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
okay. Okay, so what that means is, in thinking the way the regulator does its job in overseeing the investment in the resources and the delivery of electricity, requires a new way perhaps a new way of thinking about it. So instead of thinking of the grid as the way we always have, what if we started thinking about it as a network? And network requires a new way of thinking around the way the grid is operated. The grid no longer is just a one-way delivery stream of electricity. Customers themselves are now able to put electricity back on the system. Customers themselves are now able to provide services to the electricity system, which means the customer's value is no longer the use of electricity, but now the provision of additional services. Which means that as the grid becomes less command and control, more of the intelligence needs to be put greater at the edge to allow for customers to allow customers to take better involvement and engagement with the system itself. So the high-level takeaways are technology is changing, electricity system itself needs to change along with it. The regulator becomes a really important actor, as Rahul was talking about, of no longer just being economic. You're now being more engaged in the way the utilities operations run, as well as engaging in organizing markets. And the future, of course, is distributed, and the way the regulator responds to that will be a really important component to ensuring an ongoing cost-effective and reliable system. So thank you.